All right, here we go. Hey, everybody. This is Thomas Mirus here. I'm the director of podcast and the person who runs the YouTube channel here at Catholic Culture. Um, this is the third and final live stream of our series of May live streams as part of our CatholicCulture.org's May fundraising campaign. I'm here with two of the really the headliners of CatholicCulture.org, our commentators and our news writer, Jeff Mirus, my dad, founder of CatholicCulture.org. He writes cultural commentary for the website, and Phil Lawler, who is our news person, the editor of Catholic World News, and writes the news commentary for CatholicCulture.org. Thank you both for coming on.
You're welcome, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here, but this is my first live stream. How about you, Phil? Have you done this before?
Never a live stream. Done things sort of like this, but this is new ground for me too.
Yeah, it's a little daunting. I was said a rosary before I sat down in my captivity chair here, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, let me introduce our campaign. We're in the middle of our Queen of May campaign, which ends on Wednesday. And during this campaign, we have a challenge grant for $50,000, which we hope to match with donations from our users, those who benefit from the website, to total another $50,000, which will enable us to win this challenge grant. We typically do two challenge campaigns each year. They're the one in the spring tends to be smaller. The one in the fall, toward the end of the year, considering the number of people who do their annual giving at the end of the year, is a larger campaign. But we need them both to keep operating. We typically at CatholicCulture.org run along on our expenses matching our income as we go along. We don't have massive reserves. We try to keep enough of a reserve to pay severance pay if we have to close. So these campaigns are very important to us. They're essential to the continuation of this particular apostolate. And we hope that all of you find what we do worthwhile enough to contribute. Thomas, how do people contribute?
Well, let me just say a little bit more, too, about the campaign, that we are at the end of this campaign. This campaign ends on May 24th, the Feast of Mary, Help of Christians. We are entrusting the continuance of this apostolate into her hands. And so we have about $11,000 left that we need to make in the last 2 days of this campaign. We're recording this on Monday, May 22nd. Some people may be listening to this after the fact, perhaps on the 23rd or even on the 24th. And so if it's still May 24th, we still need your help. If you're watching this afterwards, consider yourself excused for the time being. But we are trying to continue this website, and people who are watching may just be coming from YouTube, and they may be familiar with our podcast offerings on YouTube. But I just want to quickly say, if you haven't been to CatholicCulture.org, which is the sort of HQ of this whole project, you should check it out, because we have a lot more than just these podcasts that people on YouTube may be familiar with. We've got Catholic commentary every week, faithful to the magisterium, and balanced, but also recognizing the troubled times that we live in, which will come up in the discussion we're going to be having today. And we've got a whole news section edited by Phil, his news commentary. We have liturgical calendar resources for living the church's calendar, a large library of Catholic documents, various other things. So do check out CatholicCulture.org at some point if you're not familiar with the website itself. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be talking about how to approach commentary, whether as a news person or as a pundit, whatever you want to call it, in the Catholic world during a time when everything in the society and the church seems to be going crazy. definitely lots of positive signs in the church as well, a lot of positive things happening, but also a lot of crazy things and a lot of pushback against the positive things that are happening in various quarters, right? It's a tricky time. It's a real responsibility to be a Catholic journalist or a Catholic commentator right now, and try to stay being part of the solution and not part of the problem, overreacting in one direction or the other, or being sensationalistic and just sort of getting caught up in trying to get the clicks and things like that. So actually the discussion is going to be mostly Jeff and Phil. I am here. I'm here to moderate, basically. So Jeff and Phil will be having a little conversation about this topic that I just mentioned, but there will also be the chance for you to you in the live chat here to give your questions and comments about anything you want, not just the topic we're discussing, but anything that's sort of in Jeff and Phil's wheelhouse as commentators, current events in the church, the interaction of church with politics, general things about Catholic commentary and journalism. So, and any number of things you could ask questions about. Just to quickly wrap up this introductory segment, telling people what we're doing here, there's a few ways you can donate. The best way you can donate is to go to our website, especially if you're already signed up on our website, and use the form there. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate, and there's also a link in the show notes for that. That'll be tax deductible. Now, again, any donation you give between now and May 24th, 2023 will be doubled. Now, the other way you can donate easily is to go to PayPal, and there's a link to our PayPal in the description of this video, or if you're listening to this on the podcast after the fact, in the show notes for the podcast. Go ahead. The stage is yours, Jeff and Phil.
As you said, Thomas, the thing that is on my mind to talk to our listeners today is about how you do responsible Catholic commentary in an age when there is a lot of irresponsible commentary, frankly. And on the other hand, there's a lot of commentary that is not critical at a time when criticism, and I mean criticism in the best sense, is absolutely necessary. We're one of the very few outlets that you can find that is not dependent on some institutional church source. We're completely independent. And if you want to get your news about what's going on in the church, you're likely to get it from one of two possible sources. One, you get it from the secular media, where you very often have a strong bias against the church. And frankly, coupled with that bias is a lot of ignorance. Or, second option, you can get it from an institutional source, from a diocesan newspaper whose publisher is the bishop, for instance. And they may provide decent news coverage, but it will not be critical, even when criticism is necessary. And frankly, the last 20 years have shown us how criticism is necessary from Catholics who are loyal to the church and want to address the problems rather than simply complain about them.
Right. And criticism, that's not simply venting emotion, catastrophizing, if that's a word. Not that you can't point out catastrophes where they exist, but to sort of immediately kind of jump to the most sensational interpretation of any given event, which might not even be helpful in solving the problem, as you point out. So Phil, how do you approach that? I mean, you've been covering good things and bad things in the church for decades, and you were covering the abuse scandals in the church before many people. So you've had a lot of time to reflect and pray about how to approach these things without destroying people's faith. I mean, we see examples of people who have left the church in the course of reporting on abuse in the church. Rod Dreher, obviously a big example of that, who became Eastern Orthodox. So how have you approached, your commentary in a way that is considering not just solving the immediate problem of sexual abuse, but also the bigger issue at stake, which is faith and people staying, united to the body of Christ?
Well, it's a challenge. It's an everyday challenge. It's a challenge that you pray about. But I'd say two things on top of that prayer that have been constant for me. number one, it is our church, and I'm just enough of an ornery cuss, so I'm not going to let people take it away from me. I'm not going to let people tear it apart by their incompetence or worse. The other guiding light for me is that the truth is always on our side. And that is a real temptation, I think, for those who are part of an institution. I know because I was part of an institution. I was the editor of an archdiocesan newspaper. And I know the temptation to sugarcoat things and to justify sugarcoating, which, and here I mean sugarcoating to the point of dishonesty, and justifying it for the good of the church. And I don't buy that. I don't think that camouflaging the truth is ever for the good of the church, because our Lord promised us that the truth will make us free. And we should always be mindful that the truth is going to be on our side. Sometimes it isn't obvious how it's on our side. Sometimes it's painful enough so that we say, oh, the church is going to take a hit. And maybe the church will take a hit. That's definitely happened in the last couple of decades. But in the long run, it's for the good of the faith.
This is very interesting, this line of discussion, because I remember going to confession not too long ago. Maybe it was about a year ago, might have been a year and a half. And I had been feeling a little bit discouraged. So I discussed that with the priest in the confessional. And he said something to me which, astonishing as it sounds, I had never really reflected on in this way before. He said, you always have to keep in mind that Christ has already won the victory. And it's easy to do battle as if the victory is in doubt. And that can drive you to all kinds of extremes of self-reliance or exclusive self-interpretation of reality, which, if you realize that Christ has already won, and that your job is first and foremost to be faithful to that victory, faithful to Christ, you can avoid the temptation that comes with apostolic work, especially apostolic work that involves reporting and commentary. The temptation to, kind of seize everything and mold it to your specifications,
yes,
as if that becomes essential to the victory.
Yes, a companion thought is, well, one of my favorite quotations is from St. Augustine: God does not need my lie. And a companion thought is, Jesus has already won the victory. It's his victory. It's not our victory. It doesn't depend on us. And it's thank God it doesn't depend on us, because there would be no victory. But it's a matter of recognizing that you and I are not in charge. And that's another temptation, to think that, oh, we can fine tune this so that we can avoid the struggles that we have to get through. We can't avoid them.
Right. I mean, that's such a great connection, Phil. I mean, in the past several decades of crisis, we have seen priests and even bishops take things into their own hands. Like, if I don't do this, if I am not disobedient in this way, or even schismatic in this way, then everything will go to ruin. Instead of sort of trusting in providence that everything isn't up to me, and people will debate this or that example, but I'm speaking in a general way, that I mean, yes, God doesn't need my lie. God doesn't need my bitterness. It's actually okay to be both. You can have holy indignation about problems in the church and yet have your head on straight and sort of be able to keep a cool head. Those two things are not, mutually exclusive. You know what I mean?
Well, there's so many dimensions to this. For example, we really have to look at the situation in the church, understanding that it is not our situation, in the sense that if we don't work ourselves to death, this is just one other example, one other sidelight on it, all will be lost. This is a particular problem I had when I was a little younger. I felt like I had to work and do quote unquote apostolic work all the time because the problems we faced were so staggering. And I was reminded this the other day when we were thinking of when we would do this live stream. We were discussing which day of the week. And when we discussed Sunday, Phil said, well, I don't work on Sundays, which was a very appropriate response. There was a time in my life where I would have said, I'd better be working on Sunday and every other day of the week because the situation is so dire, which is another way of kind of putting yourself in charge of the outcome, when in fact it's what we need to do is call attention to Christ and his existence, his work, his power, and always be aware of Christ at work in so many mysterious ways that we don't know. So yes, we pray to discern what our role is and what we should be doing, but we don't go into a panic or, develop a theory or an ideology or an explanation, which does not include Christ's own work and what he permits and what he doesn't permit, what he protects in the church, what he doesn't protect, so that it's never, we have to make judgments as people. We have to make judgments about the news, whether trends are good or bad, how things are to be understood. That goes without saying. But there's always this danger when it becomes too much about my theory or my perceptions, and not enough about how also recognize.
I lost your sign. We lost your sound there, Dad. We still can't hear you. Phil, is anything else you want to talk about here while Jeff is figuring out his technical issues?
I was just going to say another challenge, a temptation that anybody in this business faces is that when you say something a little bit extreme, when you make people angry, when you rile people up, you get great feedbacks, you get lots of clicks, and that is naturally a temptation. Look, we all want to have a catchy headline. We all want to say something snappy. And I think that's a good thing. Yeah, the first job of a journalist is to be read. If nobody reads your stuff, it doesn't matter how brilliant it is. So yeah, we want to attract an audience, but it is just be mindful. It is a temptation that you attract the audience by going a little bit beyond what the facts justify, by being a little bit extreme, a little bit sensationalistic. That's a temptation that we all feel, and we at Catholic Culture try very hard not to fall into, because there's a lot of it going around. And, the news is bad enough, frankly. We don't need to embellish how bad it is. So that's another thing to look out for. And another reason why I think our service is very valuable, because I hope that people who come to Catholic Culture for news and commentary will see there a sober commentary, and will recognize that we don't often get things wrong. Everybody does sometimes, but we do. If we get it wrong, it's not because we set our hair on fire trying to attract an audience. And those of you who see the top of my head know that I'd never set my hair on fire. It wouldn't burn.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. I mean, the opinions are come by honestly, now let me just add a couple things. We just got a nice comment. I'm going to show it on the screen here from Reverend Father Alan B. Maria Wharton. Gentlemen, thanks for the live stream. The topic is pertinent and interesting. I believe one can and should point out what needs to be corrected in a way that encourages fidelity, caritas, and veritate. Thank you for your comment very much, Father. I also wanted to mention we did get a donation. I don't know if it's from somebody who's watching the live stream or just someone who happened to donate at the time while we were doing it. But Larry V or Larry P, he has a middle name and a last name, but I'm not sure if it's one name or Anyway, Larry VP, not to give away his full name, thank you for your donation if you're watching this, donated via our website. Again, reminding people we are doing a fundraiser here. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio or just /donate, or click the PayPal link in the description of this video. Please help us to make our challenge grant by May 24th. We've got about $11,000 more that we need to raise to continue for the rest of the year, and your donation at this time will be doubled. You were talking, Phil, about sensationalism. It is a problem. I mean, it's an increasing problem, I would say, over the past few years, and I've seen specific Catholic outlets sort of increase. I've seen them go down this road gradually, where they always had certain outlets. They always had a sensationalistic bent to them, but then they've gone to the point where they're just like basically. They're essentially just like SSPX outlets or whatever. You sort of see the road that somebody is going down, to the point where it's basically like advocating a sort of like parallel community to the church or something like that. Not to single out the SSPX as an example, because we have a lot of different issues that are being dealt with diplomatically and doctrinally in the church right now. Go ahead.
Let me jump in here, Thomas, if I could. Just to say, and maybe I missed something while I was, looking at my microphone connection, but there's also an interplay here between the news itself and the commentary that we write on the news. And one of the things that has always, really impressed me about, and I can be impressed by our news and commentary, because Phil is in charge of the news, and Phil does most of the commentary, though not all of it, but most of the commentary on current events. And the care that needs to be taken, the different kinds of care, when you're reporting the news, you can introduce relevant background facts, but you don't force an interpretation on people if you're reporting the news. You try to give an accurate picture of the situation as well as the particular thing that you're reporting on at the moment, but you aren't offering your opinions in that place. When you're writing commentary, then you actually try to interpret and try to indicate what you think is a good development and why, or what is a bad development and why, and put it into greater context with reference to the history of the church, Catholic teaching, fidelity to the church's teachings, and so on. But there is a line between news and commentary, which I think Catholic World News, that portion of our website, has been very, very consistent in maintaining that distinction. Very important.
I'm glad you think that. It's a distinction that you don't see as much in the media these days. It's with the proliferation of blogs and commentary. You've also seen at the same time in the conventional media, the New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth, much more opinion in news stories, much more opinionated news stories, just coming out flat in a headline and saying somebody is lying. Whereas in the past, you would say, here's what he said, here's what someone else said, there's the apparent conflict, and let the reader settle it. And the news that you get almost everywhere these days is so much more opinionated and so much more a sieve through which Orthodox Catholicism sometimes does not pass. I had a very intelligent friend who said years ago that he thought the New York Times was biased reporting on current events, but the news would be there. It might be there on page 17, and he thought it should be on page 1, and he might have to adjust for parallax as he read the news, but still it would be there. That's not the case anymore. There are important events, important statements being issued, important things being done that just are not covered in the secular media and sometimes in the Catholic media as well. And so it's important for us to point those out and give them the recognition that they need. It's a specialized, yes, we are catering to a special audience. It's niche reporting, but I'm comfortable with that if the reader is comfortable.
There's this phrase, Jeff, sorry, say something, because I don't know if your mic's working again. Yeah, we're not hearing you again. There's this phrase, Phil, you've probably heard this phrase: if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. That's a phrase that's been around even for years before, all the woke stuff happened, and this sort of emotionalization of journalism that you were talking about. But let me ask this. So, somebody might say, if you're not, almost a sign of not getting how bad things really are to some people is just the ability to be objective, and let me ask Phil if you could provide a specific example in reporting of a situation in the church that was really bad, or something that really was a problem that needed to be addressed and commented on, and yet there was a way in which you felt you were able to handle that situation in your reporting in a less sensationalistic or a more objective or nuanced way than other outlets, even though the situation was really bad, and you weren't shying away from pointing that out. Because I think people a lot of the time equate pointing out crisis with setting your hair on fire, as the phrase was used earlier. So do you have any specific examples where you were able to sort of like keep a cool head while pointing out the gravity of the realities you were reporting on?
Well, right away, I think about the sex abuse crisis, because there I was growing up in Boston, at ground zero, and being very well acquainted with some of the major players, and seeing the coverage in the Boston Globe, and knowing so much more, frankly, than the Boston Globe did. I began covering the sex abuse crisis in the mid-90s, almost a decade before the story really broke. Before the Globe broke the story and got all the Pulitzers for it. And it outraged me. I was outraged as I learned more and more. And I hope that outrage came through in my commentary, but not in my news coverage, because there were facts to be covered. And this is one of those cases where the facts were certainly damaging enough. I didn't have to embellish them, and I did report them, but I didn't want to go crazy about it. I didn't want to encourage people to hate the church. I wanted to point out that the problem was a human problem, and an institutional problem, but it's not a problem that should damage your faith. And too often, of course, it did have that effect on a lot of people, which is regrettable.
Do you think we should open it up? Do you think we should go ahead and open it up to questions, to listener questions, or do you have anything more that you want to say on this general topic?
If we have questions, let's deal with them. That way, we at least we know somebody's interested.
Well, while we're waiting a moment for questions, I'm going to just check and see if we've gotten any more donations here. We did get another donation, again, because I'm not getting a comment in the live stream. I don't actually know if it's from somebody who was watching, but we got a donation from Andrew B. So if you're listening, or even if you're not listening, thank you. God bless you, Andrew, for your support. I have a question for you that a friend of mine sent me earlier, Phil. He's not here because he has work. But he sent me a question in advance for me to pass along to you, and he donated to us earlier in the campaign. So my friend Carter Stevens, a good friend for years and years. Oh, we've got sound here. Jeff, can you hear? I don't know why he can't hear me now. Thankfully, this question is for you, Phil. So I'll go ahead and give it to you. What good friendships and connections have you made with concerned laity and clergy in your history of reporting on the various crises in the church that have borne fruit personally or spiritually?
Wow. That's a big question.
An interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, Should I go into individuals or should I speak in general terms? I'd say in general terms first. One of the things that doesn't necessarily come across is that when you're covering Catholic events, you meet a whole lot of really wonderful people. And they may or may not become the topic of a news story or even a commentary, but they're wonderful people, you know, just the sort of ordinary, wonderful people you find in a parish, prayerful people raising nice families. And that has been one of the big rewards of being in Catholic journalism. I mean, some famous, wonderful people. I had the opportunity to meet Mother Teresa of Calcutta, for instance, Mother Angelica, with whom I had a lot of dealings, and so did Jeff. But also, as I say, just good, faithful, hardworking, prayerful Catholic people. And now I'm getting feedback. Another aspect to go personally, I've just made some friends with great people. I mean, I've had a long and productive, friendly association with Jeff Mirus and with the Catholic culture, and with people who have written for us, with Father Jerry Pekorski and the late Father Paul Mankowski. He's an absolutely brilliant man.
Let's mention these, you know, Father Mankowski passed away recently, and there have been 2 volumes from Ignatius of his writings. Did you edit both of those volumes, or just the one of stuff that he came from?
Yeah, I did one. George Weigel did the other.
Yeah, so George Weigel edited the one that was from various publications, and you edited the one of his writings as under the pseudonym Diogenes for CatholicCulture.org, which you did for years. Phil, in your correspondence with Father Mankowski, how did he influence your journalistic work?
He was my most reliable go-to critic. And when I had an idea about what was going on in the church, you know, sometimes you're trying to figure out what's going on, trying to read the tea leaves, and you talk to friends, other journalists. He was not a journalist, but I would talk to him, and I would always pay a whole lot of attention to his take on things, not only because he was a very brilliant mind, but also because he was in touch with so many people. Father Paul Mankowski, for those of you who didn't have the privilege of knowing him, was probably the most influential Catholic you never heard of. He had a range of contacts and correspondence that would be remarkable, you know, from half a dozen cardinals in the Roman Curia to the Prime Minister of Australia to speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher and people in Washington and people in New York. He was in correspondence with so many people, and so many other people relied on him, which is why I think when he died, sudden and untimely deaths, several of us thought, we've got to get his work out there because more people should appreciate what he did and what he meant to so many of us, and to Catholic culture readers too, who profited for years from his wit and satire, writing as Diogenes.
Yeah, you know, I there's a lot of his work that I haven't read yet, but I always remember this line from a book review he did for First Things. I'm trying to find it, but it was a review of a biography of, here it is. The essay is titled His Excellency, and it was a review of a biography of Father Ted Hesburgh, who was in charge of the University of Notre Dame. And I got this line. I just looked it up to get the exact wording, but he says of Father Hesburgh, he passed his life in the gaze of the lidless eye of his obituarist. And I've just never forgotten that line. Obviously, the reference to the lidless eye of Sauron, you know, there that you know, of this guy who ran a university in such a way as to basically, I don't know. What would you say, Phil? You've probably know more about Hesburgh than I do, but you know, this idea that he's concerned about the optics, about his legacy, but in a kind of a worldly way, which it resulted in compromises in terms of the Catholic identity of the university. Would that be
Well,
accurate?
yeah. I mean, to cite another line that Father Minkowski would use, he showed throughout his career the courage to stand up and face the applause.
That's
he had
fantastic.
he had a brilliant wit, but he was also a master stylist, just in the use of the language. And you can see that even in his more scholarly work, like when he's doing scriptural analysis or discussing scriptural interpretation issues. I mean, it's just brilliant, not only in terms of the content, but in terms of the expression. He was always a delight to read. Truly remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, we found his work worthy of inclusion in the Catholic Culture audiobooks podcast alongside, John Henry Newman, the Church Fathers, and, Romano Guardini and whoever else, Ratzinger, specifically two of his classic essays on the abuse crisis in the church, which I honestly are still very current and very cutting edge in their analysis. I mean, I don't see too many other people who are giving an inside look at the culture in the priesthood and the episcopate like he does. I mean, knowing so many people, as you say, Phil, in these essays, what went wrong and Thames and clerical life, particularly the latter one, is just I think essential reading for somebody who's trying to understand what is going on beyond closed doors. The problem is not that 90% of priests are homosexuals or abusers. That the problem is something a little bit more seemingly mild and milquetoast, but basically leads to many problems in clerical culture just not being addressed because there's just kind of this go along to get along kind of attitude.
One thing I wanted to get into here, in light of the discussion so far, which I at least have been able to hear, is because we're aware of the sensitivity of constantly dealing with the decline of Christian influence in our culture, and the fact that the church members are naturally drawn from the culture and therefore influenced profoundly by the culture, and consequently seem to have this kind of steady decline that we're constantly dealing with in terms of it's not always in terms of the solidity of those who are teaching in the church, but it has frequently been that. And in some countries, the situation is worse than others. But also in terms of the influence of the church on the larger culture and the different ways in which churchmen try to retain an influence, sometimes by being as accommodationist as possible, and sometimes by being as confrontational as possible, but that's far more rare. All these things can, and we've had people tell us this, our readers, can be discouraging to those who follow what's going on CatholicCulture.org, so that they can become a little depressed. And that's one reason very definitely one reason why CatholicCulture.org does not stop with just the news and commentary. I mean, that's why one important reason that we have the podcasting, which is much more engaged in culture, in Catholic culture, and finding, good things as well as critical things to talk about in the culture. It's one reason why we have why in our written commentary we do more than just comment on the news. We comment on other things as well, sometimes very uplifting things, and also why we have the spiritual resources that we do. With our liturgical year section, which is all about living the liturgical year. In the library and in our reference areas, we try to put positive things, encyclicals, conciliar documents, works of the fathers of the church. A lot of this a lot of these things are available online elsewhere now. Having a good library was far more important 20 years ago than it is today. But the point is, we want our range of offerings to promote a spiritual, a real spirituality in each user who takes advantage of our resources, so that there's a context, a much larger Catholic context, in which to actually deal with the problems that we're also addressing, because they can be very discouraging at times. So it's an important part of our mission.
Jeff, I think it's important. That's important in a couple of ways. One is that what we're trying to do, as you say, a lot of these resources, particularly the library resources, you can find somewhere else. And that wasn't the case when you started compiling things for what's now the Catholic Culture Library. But we're trying to offer people a sort of one-stop shopping. You know, if you go to Catholic Culture, it's there for you. You can get the spiritual resources, the liturgical calendar, the encyclicals, the commentary. You can get all those things elsewhere, different commentaries maybe, but we're trying to make it simple for you, for those Catholics out there who are trying to stay informed and lead a good Catholic life and be in tune with the thinking of the church and what's going on in the church. We're trying to make it all there for you. And I hope that that's something that our regular readers appreciate. And I hope that it's something that maybe people who are listening to this podcast, if you go to the Catholic Culture site and just hunt around a little bit, you will be impressed by how many different things are there.
And yes, I mean, just to give an example of that, we even added, some of the church fathers and stuff we have, they're available on other sites like New Advent, but we recently added a collection of addresses by Pope Pius XII given to newlywed couples, which was not available anywhere online, including on the Vatican website. I don't think that it was even in Italian on the Vatican website. And it was an out of print or a public domain book translation that was published in like the 70s or 80s, I think. And I found out that it was public domain. And so we scanned it. Our one of our staff members scanned and sort of converted to text. And this entire collection, which is kind of like a pre-Vatican II, equivalent to theology of the body, not in the lens that it takes. Obviously, theology of the body has its own unique methodology, but in terms of being this set of papal catechesis, that's a pretty thorough catechesis on different aspects of married life, and very pastoral. Very pastoral, sensitive to modern conditions, but also very solidly traditional, very much in the spirit of his predecessor, Pius XI's Casti Connubii, almost like an expansion on that in the form of various catecheses. That's all on our website now, and you can't get that anywhere else online. You'd have to buy like a reprint that was done by, I think, like the SSBX bookstore to get that otherwise.
And Thomas, you discovered that. In fact, I was looking back at that before we tried to start the live stream, or the live stream, as the case may be. But I was looking back at it because it kind of represents, in the very recent past, I mean, the last really weeks, the addition of something that was typical of the material we added to our library when we first started working on our library in the 90s. For a while, we gave our library material to EWTN before we had our own website. Then later, when we developed our websites, and we had 3 different websites between the two of us, between Phil and Trinity Communications, because Catholic World News was a separate website at first. Then it merged with what was originally called Peter's Net and had become CatholicCulture.org into a more complete thing. But in those early days, as Phil mentioned, having these resources available online was a tremendous step toward making really solid material available to people. And while that's not as common that we have, kind of a coup like that, this book of the Audiences to Newlyweds by Pope Pius XII, which you found, for us, and which we had our librarians scan and convert to digital form. I was looking back at that today, and I think he started it in 1939. And if I remember correctly, by about 1941, his ability to keep going was diminishing with all the pressures on him leading up to war, and as his health was not quite as good, so he finally had to discontinue it. But that our attention to things like that, I think, is very important. And in addition to that, I'd like to say one other thing about the way we approach the material that we discuss and comment on. And I don't know, this may betray a prejudice, but I like to think that we're solid spiritually and intellectually, certainly strive for that, but without being intellectuals in the way we approach things. I have a very strong feelings, and perhaps too strong, but I always say that if you can't get your point across, and I don't always do this, but if you can't get your point across in 1,000 words, and this is an exaggeration, I admit, but if you can't do that, you probably don't really fully understand what you're trying to say. Mostly to make a good, strong point, you don't have to write a book. And I think it's one of the advantages of the web that that brevity works very well with the web. People's attention spans may be shorter, but it's important to be able to communicate briefly and clearly rather than beat a subject to death. And I'll just segue from there into one more point, which I think is a little bit humorous. Now I have the trouble, since I've been doing this for a good long time in my own commentary, now I have the trouble of trying to figure out whether I've already said what I'm setting out to say. And sometimes I write something that I think is really good, and it just flowed really easily, and I'm really pleased with it. And then I remember, well, let me look back and see if I've covered this before. And the reason I remember, the reason it flowed so easily was because I wrote it last week. Now, usually that's not the case. Usually it's a question of, did I say the same thing 2 years ago, or 10 years ago? And if it's 10 years ago, I'm not worried about it. If it's 2 years ago, I might, want to see if I can be a little bit more original. But this may just be age, but it's probably just, the material, the amount of material that one has written over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And this is becoming a real interesting part of my job.
It is, when you've been writing about similar subjects for so long, and you say, well, didn't I already say this? But maybe new facts in the case, and lots of people who haven't seen what you wrote 5 or 10 years ago,
right.
And they cannot be deprived of our priceless wisdom.
Exactly.
All right. Let me remind the viewers and listeners, even if you're listening to this after the fact, we are in a fundraising campaign for CatholicCulture.org to continue for the rest of the year. And it's going until March 24th, the Queen of May campaign ending on the Feast of Mary, Help of Christians. And we need your help.
May 24th, Thomas. You said March 24th.
Yep, May 24th. Sorry about that. May 24th, it's ending. Just a day or two to go. We need to make about $11,000 to win our $50,000 matching grant. So any donation you make, though, up to that will be doubled. So please do help us out. You can go to catholicculture.org/donate, or look at the show notes, the description of the video for the link to our PayPal. We did get a donation from Brendan W. Thank you very much, Brendan, if you're watching, and we really appreciate your help. Now we've got about, if we get questions, we'll go for another 25 minutes or so. If we don't get questions, then we will just sort of wind down when we feel like it. Yeah, we've got a few people watching, I know. So please, questions, comments for Jeff and Phil, any Catholic current events you want to ask, get their take on, any hot takes on any particular topics you'd like to hear, please throw us a comment so we can answer your questions, because we're not going to do another one of these for a while.
Or we could go all Verizon and just say, "Can you hear me now?" every few minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So anybody who's watching, don't just lurk, ask a question. But what's the big am I crazy, or are we in a slight news slump at the moment? I don't mean the larger moment, but in the past couple of weeks, is there any big breaking stories in the church, Phil?
Oh, well, I think all eyes are pointed towards the Synod on synodality, which looks to be another Donnybrook. And that will happen in October, although I think the preliminary fights will begin before that. And that's the biggest story that's developing. That's predictable.
Well, I guess the big news is the inclusion of lay people, the inclusion of women in the Synod, right?
I don't know. I mean, yes, that's the news that people are talking about.
I'm not saying it's news that anybody should care about. I'm just saying that's what people are talking about right now.
That is what's people. Actually, I'm glad you brought it up, because that's a classic example of where I think perspective is needed. All of the secular media headlines were about, oh my gosh, there are going to be women in the Synod. Well, they're going to be women in the Synod because there are going to be lay people in the Synod. That's the more important change. And
right,
once the Vatican decided that there were going to be lay people, they then moved one step further and said half of those lay people have to be women. It's frankly a very, very odd choice, because this is a Synod of bishops. And once you include lay people, it's no longer a Synod of bishops. Synod of bishops with capital letter, but it's not a Synod of bishops. It's now a Synod of bishops with some lay people participating. But it will be a fight. There's no question about that. And it's coming right at you. And it's a very important fight, although it's kind of inside ball, that because it's a fight about how the church is governed. And synodality is a reference to the way the church makes decisions. And that's really not what the discussion has been about. The discussion leading up to it has been almost exclusively about various people who want the church to change in a number of different ways to accord with their thinking. And whether you agree with them or not, those are not arguments about the way the church makes decisions. These are arguments about decisions the church should make. You see the distinction there.
Yes.
And so that's a thread that's missing from the current debate almost entirely.
It's interesting that when Father Pokorski, who graces our web pages with his commentaries very frequently, more frequently than we probably deserve, although he also writes elsewhere, when he did his somewhat satirical take on the preparations leading up to the Synod, he made a number of interesting points, but one of them was that this is about the most expensive way you could possibly go about gathering people's discontents into a single basket and presenting them to Rome.
Yeah, well, it's given an awful lot of people something to do for the last couple of years. And the late Russell Kirk used to talk about a category of people that he called the church mice. You know, the people who are always around a church.
Yes.
It's not entirely clear what they're doing in the church, but they're always around. And this Synod has brought out the church mice.
That's true. That's very true. And interestingly enough, this is one of the continuing tensions arising from the Second Vatican Council's effort, and I think it was a genuine effort, to get each Catholic to more fully realize his or her vocation. And I noticed this, very early on, after the council. I mean, I came of age in the years immediately following the council. I was in college from 1966 to 1970, for example. But I noticed that for so many people, becoming fully actualized as a Catholic meant having a quasi-clerical role.
Yes.
So the extraordinary ministries, as they're sometimes called, developed, and people thought they were making, as lay people, were making a special contribution to the church because they were a lector at Mass or something of that type. And there's nothing wrong with being a lector. Don't get me wrong about this, but there's a whole field of activity for the layperson in living out his Christocentricity or her Christocentricity, which does not involve liturgical life or ecclesiastical governance.
So
And
true.
this seems, you refer to the church mice, but this seems to often get lost in terms of who's ends up being on the inside of many discussions, who gets added to the panels and things like this.
And, Jeff, there's a corresponding trend since Vatican II. While lay people have been finding things to do inside the sanctuary, that clerics and also religious have been going out into the world and doing political things,
Yes.
taking that as their job, which is very clear. And it's, by the way, very clear in the documents of Vatican II. That is the role of the laity. And when you have a priest who's dedicated himself to changing the world through socio-political activism, look, the truth of the matter is, if you're a priest and you have views on politics, I don't care. That's not, I mean, they may or may not make sense, but please don't expect me to give them special status because of your priesthood. On the contrary, you are set apart from ministry, and if you devote yourself to that, then you will be doing much more for the kingdom of God.
Right. I mean, as you were right before you said that, Phil, I had a similar thought about even for many of us who are in the church, who are increasingly embracing the views, the teachings of the various 19th century and early 20th century popes on the supremacy of the power of the church over temporal authorities in various respects. Even to us, that doesn't mean clerics becoming government officials, for instance. So that would be like a converse kind of example to lay people thinking being involved in the church means being in the sanctuary.
Yes, and we do tend to reduce everything in the modern world to politics. You can see this in what gets the most prominence from the national Episcopal conferences or the regional Episcopal conferences, where the things that tend to get reported most heavily are the latest recommendations that some committee has made to the Congress or the Senate or the president, and this is in many different countries. It's certainly common in the United States and Canada and Europe, and it becomes almost ridiculous in terms of the clerical role in trying to guide civic life, when if those who are called to ministry within the church would concentrate primarily, really almost exclusively, on drawing people into the church sacramentally and doctrinally and forming them, then you'd have a larger number of lay people who would make a difference politically just by the fact that they're in the world and they have to vote. It's just astonishing.
Hey, we have our first live viewer question. He Who Lives asks, does your website have the entire Fathers of the Church collection? I have it in various series and hard copy. But it would be useful to be able to access it easily online. Jeff, you can answer that.
Yeah, probably nobody has the entire Fathers of the Church collection, even in printed form. The Catholic University of America has perhaps done the best job in their many years of collecting patristic texts.
But it's ongoing. It's an ongoing project.
It's an ongoing thing. It's certainly not complete. What we have is basically the older Erdman's patristic series that was done in the latter part, I believe, of the 19th century and is in the public domain. So we have a wonderful collection of patristic texts, but we don't by any means have as many, say, as have been published by the Catholic University and are available in print.
Yeah. But it's a fine reflection of, the patristic texts that were sort of available in English in the late 19th century.
That's correct. That's correct. It's probably as complete as anything was at that time.
He says Schaff and Roberts in 38 volumes. I'm not sure I don't think that's what we have.
No, that's not what we have.
Okay. Thanks for your question. I see we have a few new people in here. So yeah, anybody who has a question or comment for Jeff and Phil, any kind of current events in the church you want to ask them about, or Catholic commentary issues, the Catholic media landscape. Anything you want to talk about, we're happy to take questions. Phil, are there any stories that you that are underreported at the moment that you feel stories or aspects of stories that are not getting the attention that they deserve?
As a matter of fact, it may be my personal bugaboo, but I would really like to see some more reflection on what happened to the church during the COVID lockdown. I mean, I wrote a book about that subject because I found it astonishing and frankly unforgivable that the church is just closed. And that to me bespeaks just a misunderstanding of what the church is for. In a time of crisis, that's when I want the churches open more than any other time. So that's something I would like to see more discussion about.
When you say unforgivable, you mean it can't just be passed over. It needs to be addressed. It needs for forgiveness to happen.
Yeah.
Well, I totally agree. I had you on the Catholic Culture Podcast to talk about that book. And it would be really nice to see even just more acknowledgement. Things were not handled as well as they could have been. Even if not like personal breastbeating from bishops, just at least say something to know that you learned something, to let us know that you learned something. That's the thing that makes me uneasy. It's like, I'd like to hear we learned something from this.
And it won't happen again.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Let me just I want to come back to this, but let me just say that maybe we do have Schaff and Roberts. If they were the overall editors of the Erdman's series of patristic volumes, I just don't remember the editors' names.
Okay.
And it might have been, if that's the Erdman's series that was published in the late 19th century, then that is what we have. I'm just not sure. This question of the COVID lockdown, it would be hard. I mean, it was hard for me to imagine that the church would decide to shut so much down during the pandemic. But it would be even harder to imagine that she would do so again. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but the unanimity among bishops right up to the Pope that the best thing to do when you're facing matters of life and death is to curtail divine worship is a very peculiar set of priorities for the church.
Right.
And I think more people are aware now, at least I like to think more people are aware, even in high places, of how much this was media driven by a progressive media that tends to see government as a solution to all things, and how inaccurate so much of the information was on which the decisions were made. But without getting into those details, the larger issue is that it is almost the worst possible, perhaps the worst possible response by the church to a crisis as one can imagine, that they would have so little confidence in God, that the church would have so little confidence in God, in Jesus Christ, in the Savior of all mankind, as to think that the continuation of this, her sacramental ministry, was a danger to the human race.
Couldn't agree with you more, of course, Jeff. And that's something that has troubled me a great deal in the last few years. Just to bring it back to the, though, if I could, to the point of this live stream, another thing that has been illustrated by the COVID lockdown and the response to it, and as you say, Jeff, the selective reporting, selective and often just plain inaccurate and knowingly inaccurate reporting from the government and from media outlets, should make people aware of the need for outlets that they can trust. And,
Yes.
We're now, and because of the revelations of the last few months, really, we're now recognizing that news was deliberately suppressed by the giants of the social media. Well,
Right.
it is not impossible that our news would be deliberately suppressed. So if you
Yes.
want to be confident that you have accurate reporting, you need to support people, people like support people like us, support our work. Send me to Cancun. You need to have these resources that you can rely on without counting on somebody else to get them to you, because they might not.
Yeah. I will say too, I was talking about bitterness or in Catholic commentary or sensationalism. Things like what happened with COVID, and I'm not immune to these temptations by any means. They tend to further break down trust in the institutional church, in the hierarchy, and you think of that the renewal of the sexual abuse scandals in 2018, followed not long thereafter by the response to COVID and liturgical stuff that's been going on since then, etc. It's very easy to lose your trust, and that may be justified on a human level, in many cases, but it's also easy to be tempted to simply write off the bishops as a group in a kind of like a bitter and unjust way. Like I hear people making comments like they simply don't care about us. The bishops don't care about us. And I think that's a rash judgment, and a scandalous one, certainly to tweet publicly in view of people who might be considering entering the church. I think that in times like this, it increasingly requires heroic virtue just to stay in the church, just to truly stay in the church and not be, to not just be constantly bitter about what's going on. Again, a temptation I'm certainly susceptible to. I think it requires a really robust prayer life and a really robust work at personal conversion, and to really focus on oneself too, because otherwise one is just going to be assimilated into the bitter the bitter water that we're all drinking, and the poisonous air that we're breathing in this culture. So I think just a point I wanted to make. I think it highlights the need for genuine spiritual renewal in each of us individually, and also not waiting for somebody else to change before working on it ourselves, because that's how the church has changed. The church has changed through personal conversion, prayer, and fasting. As the old Chesterton line, what's wrong with the world? So, I mean, I know that's a little bit off the topic of CatholicCulture.org specifically, but I'm hoping that that's another thing that we can contribute, is not to make people think that they can change the world by reading the news, but that we can report the news and comment on it in such a way that actually points people towards the source, the source of change, which is grace.
Yes, and I think along with a robust prayer life, you also need friends. You need a support system.
Great
It's
point,
just
yeah.
awfully hard to do it yourself. And even if you are saintly, not that I would know, but even if you are very prayerful, you are still living in this world where you're bombarded with messages from the secular culture.
Right.
And if you don't have friends who keep reminding you that there are others who think the same way, you're going to start thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the secular culture is right about all this stuff. It happens on the margin. But if you have good friends who you can get together with and bounce ideas off and
Right.
socialize with, it's so much easier.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. Just on Sunday, yesterday, we had a homily at my parish in New York City by the young Dominican friar, who's one of the parochial vicar or associate vicar. I don't know. That might be the correct title. He's not the pastor, but he's a parish priest anyway, whatever title that is. He gave a homily that I didn't expect, but it was about the need for friendship and specifically he was talking about, if you don't have good Catholic friends, then you need to beg God to send you good Catholic friends, because this is something that we need and God will answer your prayers. So it's not, I don't know if I've heard a priest say that in a homily, that if we don't have friends, a lot of people are lonely, but to actually ask God for companions that will lead you closer to him, is actually I thought it was fantastic, counsel to give in a homily.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I might throw in one of my favorite terms, which everybody's probably sick of seeing in my writing, this whole question of the dominant culture. We all know, I don't know exactly how we know, but as human persons, we all know what the dominant culture is. We all sense it. We all sense its pressure. What suddenly becomes okay to say and what isn't okay to say. You have to be really obtuse in unusual ways not to be immediately aware of that, and that ties in with this friendship thing. If you're constantly have no positive reinforcement, it's hard enough even if you have positive reinforcement, because the attractions of the world are really serious attractions.
Yeah.
I mean, wanting to fit in, wanting to be considered a person with the right ideas, wanting to find subtle ways to improve your career as opposed to have your career stunted, to be praised more often than you're blamed. All these kinds of things factor in when you've got a dominant culture which is so overwhelmingly divorced from God. It's really important. If you really aren't attending to your prayer life, if you're only attending to being right doctrinally or morally, and not attending to your spiritual life and also your friendships, it's a very slippery slope. Because there are two easy ways to go. One easy way is to be just co-opted by the dominant culture, but the other is to fall into kind of what you might call a fringe group of people who are always in opposition, defined by opposition to the dominant culture. And as Christians,
right,
we're called to self-identify as followers of Jesus Christ, not in opposition to anything. Opposition is a healthy byproduct of following
right.
Christ, but also love is an even healthier byproduct of following Christ. And so, where love decreases and mere opposition increases, we find ourselves getting into trouble of one kind or the other very quickly, primarily because we are responding to the dominant culture in the wrong way in both cases, not in a Christian way.
That's really a good point, Jeff. And when you talk about the dominant culture, sometimes people will say, why is it that church attendance is down so dramatically in the last several decades? And the answer most often given is, oh, well, it's the culture, which is begging the question. Because why is the dominant culture dominant?
Yes.
Why is the church not forming the culture? We should be forming the culture. And I firmly believe we can form the culture, not only because I believe Christianity is true, and not only because I believe that our faith gives us the wherewithal to answer the most important questions of life, but also because I look at the people who are shaped by the dominant culture, and you know what? They're miserable. They're not having fun. I think of one of the reasons we have great friends where we live. We're in a little pocket of where there's a bunch of very serious Catholics who are really trying hard to follow the faith. And when we get together, we have a blast. And some people come along and are, involved in the parties, and it's attractive, and they want to know more, and they get a little bit closer. And I think that's how, frankly, that's how you become the dominant culture, much more than, I'm sorry to say, writing essays.
Yes.
Right. Let me we're pretty much out of time here. I'm going to give like 4 or 5 more minutes just in case anybody, I see we have a few new people in the viewership. So in case anybody wants to ask a question or comment, prompt a topic of discussion for Jeff and Phil, because we're going to shut it down in just a few minutes. So please, if there's something you've been wanting to ask or just curious about Jeff Mirus or Phil Lawler, their thoughts, please shoot us a comment. Let me also remind people we are doing a fundraiser for CatholicCulture.org. The fundraiser ends on May 24th, and we have a matching grant of $50,000. But if we don't complete that $50,000 by the end of May 24th, we're not going to get that matching grant. So we've got about $11,000 left to go. Anything you give will be doubled in this time. Up to that amount. So please do consider donating. CatholicCulture.org/donate. You can do that even after this, even if you're listening to this after the fact. But keep in mind the crucial period is between now and the end of May 24th, 2023. Yeah, but we've got a few people here. Maybe shoot us a question here, or if not, we're gonna wrap up in a minute.
A lot we could talk about, of course. We could go on talking. We
Sure.
have to, break out the beer.
Yeah, and if we do this again, I'm sure it'll be less meta and more topical, because we were talking about Catholic commentary in general, and that's important. But if we do this again, I think we'll spend more time talking about specific issues that are current, that need to be discussed.
And we're still very much learning how to best use this format, Thomas. And of course, you were the.
This is my third time hosting one, so
third time, and you're the one that came up with the idea for us and put it all together. Obviously, you should have flown down from New York City to check my connections personally, but we got through it.
The good thing is that it allows for conversations that wouldn't otherwise happen in the case of YouTube, because you've never been on a podcast together before or a YouTube video together before. But even in the case of like me and Mike or me and James Mievsky last week, it's a more freewheeling conversation. It's by nature, even if we don't get a lot of listener questions, that forces me to be spontaneous and sort of keep things moving. So, some interesting conversations have already come out of it, I think. But yeah, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up because we're not getting any more questions. But thanks to everybody who was here watching, who did have comments or questions. Thanks to everybody who donated. There might have been some people giving on PayPal, and thanks to all those people as well. I can't see that account right now because James has the email address and the phone number, and everything that you log into now has sends you a text, with a code. And that means I have to text James to send me the code that he got in his text if I want to log into the PayPal account and see who's donated during this live stream on PayPal.
Yeah, the circularity is unending.
Yes. Yeah, we'll see. Well, but then, thanks to everybody who participated. And we'll see if we do any more of these live streams. But this is the end of this short series of live streams. And thanks to anybody, especially who showed up for more than one of them heroically. So, all right. Thanks to you. And
thanks to all.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Phil. And we'll wrap it up here.